Hey guys, Christian Babcock here of The Hunter's Advantage. I have tested the Exodus MMT arrows for the entire last hunting season. And during that time, I have killed 5 deer with these new arrows and have shot them into the target hundreds of times. In this video, I'm gonna talk you through my experience with the new Exodus MMTs, what I like about the arrow, what I dislike about the arrow, and if I will continue to use the MMTs in the next season. Let's get into it. So I've been bow hunting for the last 13 deer seasons straight, and during that time I have used a variety of different arrows. One of the common themes that I've seen on arrow reviews on YouTube is people get the arrow out of the box, they shoot it into the target a few times, and they start to provide their opinion on what they think this arrow will do in a hunting situation. And in reality, you can never tell what something's gonna do in a hunting situation unless you actually have experience with it. So instead of putting out a subpar review this last October when I got the Exodus MMTs, I decided I'm gonna use them this entire season, shoot them through multiple animals, gather results, and formulate my own opinion through actual experience with the arrows. So I'm sorry that this review took a while to put together, but it took us about 3.5 months to even formulate an opinion on the Exodus MMT. So right before the 2022 hunting season in August and September of last season, Exodus Outdoor Gear started talking about a new arrow product that they were going to bring to the market before the hunting season. Unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably seen some Exodus Outdoor Gear content on social media, especially their very popular series, Whitetail Cribs. So before they came out, Exodus made some promises about these new arrows. One of the first ones being, in each set of a dozen arrows, they are plus or minus 2 grains of build tolerance weight, and they are fletched from the exact same jig for consistency. They promise customers that they will only use high quality components when building these arrows. And in a world of FOC and heavy arrows, they promised that these were purpose built with momentum in mind to help bow hunters maximize penetration. There's a lot more things that Exodus has to say about these arrows, and I will leave a link in the description to their website if you want to go read the full scoop on the new Exodus MMTs. And full transparency, before we get into my experience, Exodus did send me and the Hunter's Advantage crew 3 dozen of these arrows for us to try this fall, but in no way is that going to impact my review. So let's dig into my experience with the new arrows. Initially, when I switched from the Easton 4mm and 5mm FMJs, that means I was sacrificing roughly 19% on arrow weight straight out of the gate. I was pretty much committing the gravest sin in the bow hunting community, shooting a lighter arrow.
No way.
Nowadays, you see people that are completely fine getting 25 yards of max range and shooting a 700 grain piss missile in order to kill a deer, and looking down on people that are shooting a 450 grain arrow saying that's unethical. I mean, man, I get going for a heavier arrow, but we have way over-indexed onto the other side. And being a guy who wants to be ethical, shoot an arrow that is heavy enough to take down any big game in North America, I was cognizant of that when I was switching to the MMT. The other things you have to factor in that are really important to me are range out of your bow sight and being as accurate as possible. That is always going to be my #1 priority with an arrow build. So in the process of switching to the MMT, I went from about 540 grains of total arrow weight to about 475 grains with the MMT. And in the process, I switched from 100 grain broadheads to 125 grain, which is a rough loss of about 65 grains per arrow. So when I pulled these arrows out of the box, they were extremely easy to sight in. I mean, the only main difference between these and my FMJ was going out with my HHA sight and resighting in for my 20 yard and then finding that correct distance at my 60 yard pin and then lining up a new sight tape. It really was that simple. And when I pulled them out of the box, I was kind of shocked that they were so well built and they looked very premium. You have to keep in mind that this is Exodus's first stab at the arrow market. Right out of the box, it seemed like a really good first attempt. And I'm a stiffler about arrows, so I looked at each vein with a critical eye, and I didn't find anything as much as a piece of glue that was out of line on these arrows out of the box. So in the title of this video, I talked about shooting deer with these arrows. So now let's walk through each one of my bow hunts this season and my experience shooting deer with the MMTs. So I started out, my first kill with the MMT was on public land in the late part of October. I went out after a big rainfall. I got into the tree at about noon. At about 1:15, I had 3 does come by. And when you're at deer camp on public land, 6 hours away from home in the mountains, it's time to get the killing started. So this was a perfect opportunity to try out the new MMT. I drew back on this doe, found my anchor points, and at 25 yards, hammered her. She ducked just a little bit, but with a good NAP Thunderhead fixed blade broadhead and that MMT, I blew through her, double lung, stuck the arrow in the ground. Earlier this season, I shot the biggest buck of my life with an Easton 4mm FMJ with a fixed blade broadhead and got terrible penetration right behind the shoulder on a quartering away shot. I followed up that shot with another one at 25 yards, quartering hard away, and that ended up being a lethal one with the Easton. But both of those shots with the 4mm FMJ had very little penetration, and I understand they were somewhat of steep angles, but I was kind of gun shy after that experience in the first part of the season and was very happy to see that the MMT blew through on my first shot of the year with it. Fast forward to the second week of the rutcation. We were in Kansas on public land. I scouted a really cool field on private land that backed up to some walk-in hunting area and decided to go in for a bow hunt on the ground. I hid behind a rock pile, literally the only place in this entire plains to hide, with my bow and waited for a deer. So at last light, I had some does come by and I snort wheezed a buck in to 25 yards. Right at last shooting light, I drew back, settled my pin on this buck, which was quartering to me probably at 15 or 20 degrees, and sent an MMT right behind the shoulder and got a complete pass through on this Kansas buck. This is kind of what made me a believer in these arrows, because I shot this deer right behind the shoulder, quartering to me, and this arrow went coast to coast. I mean, went through the shoulder, one lung, liver, guts, out the back hip, basically started behind the front shoulders and exited at the back hip, and was an instant pass through, and that deer didn't make it 90 yards. Fast forward to the first week of December, one of the last days of rifle season, and I'm still at it bow hunting in Oklahoma on one of my leases. I have a 5.5-year-old big bodied 7-point come in at first light on December 5th. I draw back on this buck, and I'm in a stand that's kind of set up for a lefty, so I'm leaning way out, and I'm kind of sick at this moment too, so I'm just trying to get this shot off fairly quickly. I hadn't shot my bow very much in the last few weeks after our rutcation, so I definitely released this arrow a little prematurely when pulling through my shot. But as I was settling on the heart of this buck, I was 2 inches from missing this buck completely. But to my surprise, on a slightly quartering away shot, shot the deer, complete pass through, arrows laying on the ground past him. I'm basically crawling out of my stand to use the restroom before I'm even watching this deer go down. And I look over to my left, and 60 yards away, this deer's piled up, completely heart shot him, pass through. Another flying colors on an MMT. So more recently, on January 14th, I went out for a end of the year doe hunt, trying to fill the rest of my doe tags. I had 3 tags left in Oklahoma, and I was really focused on taking out 3 does in one weekend. On the evening of the 14th in January, what I did was went out to the stand and got some epic kill shot footage on this first doe. Even though these deer were late season and they were really spooky and were ducking my arrows to the max, got 2 beautiful pass throughs. The first one, a double lung, high lung, and you can see this arrow passes through the animal, no problem at all, and it is spraying blood on the way to about a 40-yard run and a quick kill. On the second animal, same old song and dance. I hold low on the doe. Of course, it's late season. It's my first time shooting a thumb button release. I let the arrow go. Another high lung shot. The deer runs 120 yards, spraying blood as it's leaving the frame. And I actually stuck that MMT into the ground on the other side of the deer. So I told you guys that I waited about 3.5 months to put this review out and wanted to get a full season's worth of experience with these arrows before I start recommending them to people or not recommending them to people, depending on how good a performance they had. After I used them extensively, I was very happy with the results. I mean, 5 deer, 5 pass-throughs, and just a heck of a season. Recovered every single deer that I shot with the MMT, and some of those were not my better shots. You know, a couple of those deer ducked pretty hard, and one of them was barely above the belly of the deer and ended up heart shotting him. So I was very pleased with my experience in the fall of 2022. So before we get into some of the things that I disliked about the arrow, let's talk a little bit more of the specific things that I liked from my experience using the Exodus MMTs. Like I talked about earlier on how I switched from a heavier arrow to a lighter arrow, what that subsequently did was give me more range out of my bow sight. I was previously maxing out my bow sight at about 80 yards. I was able to extend my max range on my scroll wheel from 80 yards to 100 yards, and that's a big deal to me. What that also does is give you more room for error. So let's say a deer is at 21 yards, it takes a few more steps and ends up being at 26. If you're shooting a very heavy arrow, that could be a 2 or 3 inch difference in where your impact is going to be, because you have a lot more weight dragging that arrow down. With a lighter arrow, you have more room for error on your distance judging, and I know when I'm shooting a lighter arrow, I have a lot more confidence that if that deer takes an extra step or two, it's not going to be the difference between me missing it completely and double lunging it and it running off for a quick death. Let's briefly talk about penetration. When I switched to this arrow, this was my number one concern, was going from something that was 540 grains to something that's 475. I worried, man, I'm gonna be sacrificing penetration. Each one of the shots that I got on deer this season with this arrow were all pass-throughs on every one of the 5 deer that I shot. And that includes deer in a lot of different environments, different shot angles, different distances. It just performed well on penetration in every way that I could expect it to. Now, a lot of this could be due to the fact that I switched to a very sharp fixed blade broadhead at the same time. So I'm not gonna equate all of the penetration goodness to the MMT, but I will say I think it had a good amount of a role to play. I did briefly wanna talk about durability. I kind of joked the last few seasons that I was using the Easton FMJs that these were one-use arrows, because it seemed like no matter what happened, in one way or another, these arrows were getting broken when I was shooting a deer. Since the Easton FMJs are made out of aluminum, every time you shoot a deer, it seems like they can move and the arrow will get bent or it'll snap in half. The opposite experience that I had with the MMT. The only time that I broke an arrow was when I didn't change my scroll wheel from 20 to 50 and I shot at a target and absolutely blasted a rock. I don't expect any arrow to withstand hitting a rock head on. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this arrow was they do have a white logo wrap on the middle portion of the arrow that has the Exodus branding on it. But what I used that for was as a place to check for a correct color of blood on my arrow. If you've been bow hunting long enough, you know that most arrows are black, and it can sometimes get hard to see the exact shade of the blood or if there's bubbles on the blood, and you're usually checking your fletchings for that. Well, with this white arrow wrap, what it allowed me to do was see exactly if I hit a dark red blood like liver, if I hit a bright pink bubbly blood like lungs, or if there was any gut material or anything like that on the arrow. And most of you guys probably know that that color and shade of the blood on that wrap can be the difference between going after a deer 30 minutes after you shot it or waiting an entire night. So being accurate on exactly where you hit the deer can help you quite a bit, and that wrap is definitely part of that equation. So before we get into the what I disliked about the Exodus MMT section, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this video so far. We've got a ton of bow hunting content on the channel, including a lot of hunts that we took these arrows on last season. But before we move on, let's move into a word from our sponsor of this video, Out on a Limb Manufacturing.
The Hunter's Advantage podcast is powered by Out on a Limb Manufacturing. Out on a Limb is a family-owned company based right here in Oklahoma that makes tree stands, saddle platforms, climbing sticks, and so much more.
Christian, I have a quick question.
What's that?
What bites down harder, a hippo or an alligator?
No idea.
It's a trick question. The Ridge Runner 2.0 bites harder than both of them. But all jokes aside, we use these products all across the land on public or private. These help us get into any tree we want and hunt where the deer actually are.
Most men go to the grocery store for their meat, but these products help you go to God's grocery store. I have used the Out on a Limb Ridge Runner 2.0 and the Shakar sticks for the last few years hunting public land bucks, and I've actually shot several bucks out of this setup. If you want to support the podcast and get some Out on a Limb equipment, make sure to go to outonalimbmfg.com and use code HNTA10 for 10% off at checkout. Once again, if you want to support the podcast, go to outonalimbmfg.com and use code HNTA10 at checkout for 10% off. Now let's get back to the podcast.
And with that word from Out on a Limb Manufacturing wrapped up, let's move into the what I disliked about the Exodus MMT after using it for a full season.
So now that I've told you a little bit about the Exodus MMT, my experience with it, and what I liked about the arrow, I'm going to get into some of the things that I disliked. Most of you guys are pretty familiar that we live in a world of customizability. Everyone wants a quiver that matches their arrow wraps, that matches their grip, that matches their nock color, and so on and so forth. And apart from being able to change the nocks and a few different vane configurations, there's not much customizability on the Exodus MMT. So if you're one of the guys that really cares about matching every single part of your setup with the same color, these arrows are not going to offer that level of customizability with them. I'm not completely sure whether they plan on offering more customizable options in the future, but since this was a first edition arrow, I can't imagine them getting any less customizable, and I could definitely see as they start to scale up the business and get more arrow orders in, that there could be some room to offer some more customizable vane, nock, and wrap options for you guys that are into that kind of thing. If you guys have ordered custom arrows in the past, it is no secret that custom is definitely more expensive than just buying a regular set of dozen arrows at Bass Pro Shop. I've been ordering custom arrows for the last 3 seasons, and I think my Easton FMJ order that I've been doing for the last few seasons was around $230 for a dozen arrows plus shipping. So with fully customizable vanes, fully customizable wraps, a ton of different nock options, and that includes field tips with every single arrow, the total price for a dozen arrows custom from Black Ovis in my last orders before I switched to the Exodus MMTs was around $250. And if you want to total that up and divide it, it's easily over $20 an arrow. So the Exodus MMTs do come custom built and tailored to your exact specs. So your draw length, your draw weight, your desired length, all those sort of things. They also come in with a hefty price tag of about $240. Even though I didn't pay for these arrows, I did want to mention it for the guys that are considering purchasing these. And like I said before, if you're one of the guys that wants the most tailor-built arrows customized for your specs, optimized for your bow, these are probably going to be something that will interest you and probably worth the price tag, especially for the folks that want arrows that are optimized and built specifically with momentum in mind, and people that are mostly concerned with accuracy and they don't care about all the other bells and whistles. They just want a lethal arrow that is as accurate and as purpose built for momentum and penetration. These arrows are definitely that. But on the contrary, if you're one of the guys that likes to save $1 at every single turn and you could care less about having an arrow that is built specifically for your setup, then these probably aren't going to be the arrows for you. I will say that we do owe it to the animal to be at our best. And when we decide to chunk an arrow downrange at a living creature, we do owe it to them to be at our most accurate form. And I think an arrow build built specifically for your specs and setup are a big part of that equation. I did break a few vanes while I was shooting them through animals. And to be honest, if that's one of the main things that you dislike about an arrow, that means they're in pretty good shape, because not only have I broken dozens of arrows while shooting through animals, the vanes are kind of the least of your worries because it's fairly easy to take the glue off the vanes and refletch them with a jig. You can't expect a sharp stick going through an animal to not catch on anything or break any vanes with every single shot and come out the other side pristine with no damage every single time. But this was my experience, so I wanted to mention it to you guys. So wrapping up here, after using the Exodus MMTs for 3.5 months, shooting hundreds of arrows downrange into the target and harvesting 5 deer with them in total this fall, I can confidently recommend these arrows for those guys that are serious about being the most accurate bow hunter that you possibly can be. And look, these arrows aren't perfect. I don't expect them to be, and they definitely are pricey. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching the video. We really appreciate it. If you'd enjoyed this kind of content and an in-depth review on the Exodus MMT arrows, make sure to subscribe to the channel, turn that bell notification on, and we will catch you guys in the next video.